The gunshot echoed through the empty streets of Austin, Texas, as Reed Thompson pressed his back against the weathered wall of the saloon. Blood trickled down his arm, but he paid it no mind. The year was 1875, and the man who just tried to kill him, his former business partner, lay face down in the dirt. Reed hadn't wanted to pull the trigger, but when a man draws on you in the Texas sun, there aren't many choices left. 3 months later, Reed sat alone on the porch of his ranch house, 5 miles outside of Austin. At 32, he'd built the home with his own hands, alongside his wife Sarah. Now, 2 years after losing her to fever, the house stood as empty as his heart. The cattle business kept his hands busy from sunup to sundown, but nothing filled the hollow spaces between dusk and dawn. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain as Reed stared at the horizon. His land stretched for nearly 200 acres, good grazing territory that had cost him years of sweat and determination. The house itself was sturdy, with 3 bedrooms he'd never use, a kitchen where no meals were cooked, and a parlor where no laughter had been heard since Sarah closed her eyes for the last time. Mr. Thompson. The unfamiliar female voice startled Reed from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman standing at the base of his porch steps, her honey-brown hair pulled back beneath a modest bonnet. She wore a simple blue dress, dusty at the hem from travel. "Who's asking?" Reed's voice came out rougher than intended. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, save for his ranch hands. "Grace Taylor," she replied, standing straight despite her obvious fatigue. "I believe you advertised for a housekeeper." Reed frowned. He'd placed that advertisement in the Austin newspaper nearly 2 months ago, then promptly forgotten about it. Nobody in their right mind wanted to live this far out from town, especially to keep house for a man rumored to have killed more than one person in self-defense. "That position's been filled," he lied, not wanting to deal with the complications of a woman in his home. Grace Taylor's green eyes flashed with something disappointment, perhaps, or determination. "That's peculiar, Mr. Thompson, as your foreman, Mr. Calloway, told me just this morning that you were still in need of household help." Reed made a mental note to have a word with Hank Calloway about minding his own business. "My foreman speaks out of turn." "Perhaps." She didn't move from her spot. Or perhaps he's concerned that his employer lives like a hermit in a house gathering dust. Her direct gaze challenged him. "I need the work, Mr. Thompson, and you need the help. I'm capable, discreet, and not afraid of hard work or isolation." Reed studied her. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed, but there was nothing girlish about her demeanor. Her hands were work-worn, and behind that determined expression, he detected the shadow of someone who'd seen her share of hardships. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "St. Louis, originally." "My husband died 2 years ago, mining accident in Colorado. I've been making my way eastward since, taking work where I can find it." "A widow, then, like him. Any children?" She shook her head. "We hadn't been blessed yet." Reed sighed heavily. "The pay is modest, Mrs. Taylor. Room and board plus $8 a week." "That's generous enough," she replied, shifting the small valise in her hand. "And it's Miss. I returned to my maiden name after James passed. For reasons Reed couldn't explain, this detail stuck with him. You can have the room at the back of the house. It gets the morning sun." Sarah had used it for sewing. "I expect breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. I don't require fancy cooking, just sustenance." "I understand." She nodded, her expression neutral but relieved. "Laundry day is Monday unless it rains." "The ranch hands have their own quarters and cook for themselves, so you'll only be looking after the main house." Reed stood, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. "I rise early and work late. You'll find I'm not much for conversation." A slight smile touched her lips. "That suits me fine, Mr. Thompson. I'm here to work, not to socialize." Reed couldn't explain the odd sensation that rippled through him as he showed her into the house. It had been so long since a woman had crossed this threshold that the very air seemed to shift and rearrange itself. Grace looked around the dusty parlor, taking in the cobwebs in the corners and the neglected furniture. Rather than appearing dismayed, she simply nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "I'll need some hot water to start with," she said, setting down her valise. "And perhaps you could show me where the cleaning supplies are kept." By sundown, Grace had transformed the kitchen and dining room. Surfaces gleamed, floors had been swept, and somehow the house already smelled different, like lemon oil and soap rather than dust and disuse. Reed ate his supper in silence, but he couldn't help noticing how the plate before him was arranged with care, the beans seasoned properly, the cornbread fresh and warm. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Thompson?" Grace asked as she cleared his plate. "No," he replied, then added awkwardly, "The meal was good, thank you." She nodded, a faint smile crossing her features. "Good night, then." As Reed lay in his bed that night, he found himself acutely aware of another person's presence in the house. The soft sounds of movement, a door closing, water being poured, the creak of a bed reminded him of a time when his home had felt alive. He wasn't sure he welcomed the reminder. The next morning, Reed woke to the aroma of coffee brewing and bacon frying. For a disorienting moment, he thought Sarah had returned, and his heart clenched with a familiar pain when reality reasserted itself. Grace had prepared a breakfast that put his usual hardtack and cold coffee to shame. Eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and biscuits with gravy covered the table. "This is too much," he said, frowning at the spread. "A working man needs proper food," she replied simply. "Eat what you want. I'll give the rest to the dogs if need be." Reed meant to take just enough to quiet his hunger but found himself cleaning his plate. Grace worked efficiently around the kitchen as he ate, not attempting conversation. "I'll be working the north pasture today," he said as he rose from the table. "Won't be back till sunset." "I'll have supper waiting," she assured him. The days fell into a pattern. Reed would leave at dawn and return at dusk to find his house gradually transforming. Rooms that had been closed off for years were opened, aired out and cleaned. Furniture was polished, curtains washed and mended. Meals appeared with consistent punctuality, and his clothes were cleaned and pressed without him having to ask. What surprised Reed most was Grace's apparent comfort with solitude. She didn't prattle or force conversation, respecting his silence while somehow making her presence felt in 100 small ways. A vase of wildflowers on the table, the scent of bread baking, a mended tear in his jacket that he hadn't mentioned. A week turned into 2. October winds brought cooler temperatures, and Reed noticed Grace had found Sarah's old quilt patterns in the sewing room and started working on one in the evenings. He'd come in from the barn to find her sitting by the fire, needle flashing in the lamplight. "You don't have to work every waking moment," he said one evening, surprising himself by initiating conversation. Grace looked up, her expression questioning. "I enjoy keeping my hands busy. Idle time leads to thinking too much." The simple statement resonated with Reed, who filled his own days with punishing physical labor for precisely the same reason. "What colors are you using?" he asked, nodding toward the quilt pieces. "Blues and greens mainly, with some yellow for contrast." She held up a completed square. "I found the fabric in the chest in the sewing room. I hope you don't mind." "Sarah would have liked to see it used," Reed said, the words catching in his throat. It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in months. Grace's expression softened. She had a good eye for color. "These fabrics complement each other beautifully." Reed nodded and retreated to his usual chair, picking up the newspaper that was now regularly delivered with the supplies from town. He pretended to read, but found himself watching Grace's hands as they worked methodically through the fabric pieces. That night, he dreamed of Sarah for the first time in months. Not the Sarah of her final days, consumed by fever and pain, but the young woman who had laughed as they built their home, planning for children that never came. He woke with wetness on his cheeks and a strange lightness in his chest. The following Sunday, Reed surprised both of them by announcing he was going to church in town. "Would you like to come along?" he asked Grace, who was setting bread dough to rise. She looked startled by the invitation. "Are you certain? People might talk." "Let them," Reed replied with a shrug. "It's a long ride to make alone." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll need 20 minutes to change." They rode into Austin together, the morning crisp and clear. Reed was acutely conscious of Grace sitting beside him in the wagon, wearing her best dress, a modest navy blue affair with a white collar. Her honey-brown hair was arranged neatly beneath a matching bonnet. As expected, their arrival at the church caused a stir. Reed hadn't attended services since Sarah's funeral, and now here he was with an unknown woman at his side. He could see the questions in people's eyes, the whispers behind gloved hands. Pastor Wilson greeted them warmly. "Reed Thompson, it's good to see you among us again. And who might this be?" "Miss Grace Taylor," Reed replied, "my housekeeper." If the pastor found this unusual, he hid it well. "Welcome to our congregation, Miss Taylor." After the service, several townspeople approached, curiosity thinly veiled as friendly interest. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, was particularly persistent. "Miss Taylor, how fortunate that Mr. Thompson found someone willing to live so far from town." "Where are you from, dear?" Grace answered politely but without elaboration. Reed found himself admiring her composure in the face of barely disguised scrutiny. On the ride home, Grace was quieter than usual. Finally, she spoke. "They think I'm your mistress, don't they?" Reed nearly pulled the horses to a halt in shock at her directness. "Some might think that," he admitted. "People enjoy speculation when there's little else to occupy them." "Does it bother you what they think?" Reed considered the question. "No," he said finally, "but it might damage your reputation." Grace gave a small, sad smile. "Mr. Thompson, I'm a widow with no family, working as a housekeeper on an isolated ranch. My reputation isn't something that concerns me greatly." The honesty of her response struck Reed. "Call me Reed," he said, "at least when we're not in company." Her smile widened slightly. "Reed," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Grace." As they approached the ranch, Reed noticed Grace studying the land with interest. "You've built something substantial here," she observed. "How long have you had the ranch?" 8 years, Reed replied. "Bought the first parcel with savings from driving cattle to Kansas. Added more as I could afford it. It's beautiful country. It can be harsh, too. Drought, storms. Texas doesn't give her bounty easily." "The most valuable things rarely come without struggle," Grace said softly. Later that evening, as Reed sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace brought him a cup of coffee and, to his surprise, sat in the vacant chair beside him with her own cup. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "Not at all." The words came easily, and Reed realized he meant them. They sat in companionable silence, watching the Texas sky turn from gold to deep purple. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus. "I never thought I'd leave Missouri," Grace said after a while. "My family had a small farm there, nothing like this, just enough to get by. I thought James and I would settle nearby, raise our children close to my parents." Reed glanced at her profile in the fading light. "Life has a way of appending our plans." "Yes," she agreed. When James died, I couldn't bear to stay. Everything reminded me of what should have been. I understand that, Reed said. After Sarah, I considered selling the ranch, starting over somewhere else. Why didn't you? Reed gazed out at the land he'd worked for nearly a decade. This place was her dream as much as mine. Leaving felt like I'd be losing her twice. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. Does it get easier, the loss? Not easier, Reed replied honestly. Different. The sharp edges wear down, you learn to carry it. They fell silent again, each lost in their own memories. When darkness fully descended, they moved inside. That night, Reed heard something he hadn't heard in his house for years, soft humming as Grace worked in the kitchen. The simple melody drifted through the house, filling some of the empty spaces. As October gave way to November, the routine of the ranch shifted with the season. Reed and his hands worked to ensure the cattle would be well situated for winter. Grace began preparing the house for colder weather, sealing drafty windows and bringing out heavier linens. Reed found himself looking forward to returning home each evening. Sometimes, he would join Grace in the kitchen, sitting at the table while she prepared supper, exchanging stories about their days. He learned that she was well educated for a woman of her background, taught by her mother who had been a schoolteacher before marriage. "I've been meaning to organize these," Reed said one evening, gesturing to the bookshelf in the parlor which contained volumes that had been Sarah's. "Feel free to read any that interest you." Grace's face lit up. "Thank you. I've missed having books." The next day, when Reed returned from checking fences on the western border of his property, he found Grace in the parlor, lost in one of Sarah's novels. She looked up, startled and a bit embarrassed. "I'm sorry supper isn't ready yet. I got caught up in the story." Reed shook his head. "No need to apologize. It's good to see the books being enjoyed again." That evening, after they'd eaten, Reed didn't retreat to his room as usual. Instead, he remained in the parlor while Grace continued reading. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional turning of pages. As Thanksgiving approached, Grace asked Reed if he would like to invite his ranch hands to the main house for the holiday meal. "There are only 4 of them," she said. "It seems a shame for them to celebrate separately when there's plenty of room here." Reed hesitated. He hadn't hosted any kind of gathering since Sarah died. "You'd be willing to cook for that many?" Grace smiled. "I've cooked for threshing crews of 20 men. 5 total will be no trouble." And so, on Thanksgiving Day, Reed's quiet home was filled with the voices of Hank Calloway and the 3 other hands who worked his ranch. Grace had outdone herself with the meal: a roasted turkey, cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes, 3 kinds of pie, and more sides than the table could comfortably hold. Reed sat at the head of the table, watching as Grace served the men with easy efficiency. She had a way about her that put everyone at ease, drawing out stories from even taciturn Hank without seeming to try. "Miss Grace," said young Tom Riley, the newest hand, "this is the finest meal I've had since leaving my mama's table in Tennessee." Grace's cheeks colored with pleasure. "Thank you, Tom. There's more pie if you've room for it." "Always room for pie, madam," Tom replied with a grin. As the meal progressed, Reed was struck by how different his home felt: warm, alive, filled with conversation and laughter. Grace caught his eye across the table and smiled, a question in her gaze. Reed nodded slightly, letting her know he was managing the unaccustomed socializing. After the men had gone, stuffed with food and carrying plates of leftovers, Reed helped Grace clear the table. "Thank you," he said as they worked side by side. "This was good." "It was," she agreed. "Your men respect you a great deal." Reed shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "They're good workers." "It's more than that," Grace insisted. They care about you, especially Hank. He watches you like a father might. Hank's only 10 years my senior, Reed said with a short laugh. Age isn't always what makes someone fatherly. Grace stacked the last of the plates. You've built more than just a ranch here, Reed. You've built a small community of people who look to you. Her words stayed with Reed as he lay in bed that night. He'd never considered his relationship with his hands in such terms. He paid fair wages and provided decent quarters, but he'd kept his distance emotionally, especially after Sarah's death. The next morning, Reed made a decision. I need to ride into Austin for supplies, he told Grace at breakfast. Would you like to come along? You could do any shopping you need. Grace looked surprised but pleased. I'd like that. There are a few things I could use for Christmas preparations. They set out after breakfast, the day clear but cold. In town, Reed left Grace at the general store while he went to the bank and then to speak with the blacksmith about shoeing several horses. When he returned to the store, he found Grace in conversation with Pastor Wilson's wife, Martha. The two women seemed to be getting along well, laughing over something as Reed approached. Reed, Martha greeted him warmly. I was just telling Miss Taylor that we'd love to have her join our Ladies' Aid Society. We meet twice monthly to sew for the poor and discuss books. Reed looked to Grace, who seemed both interested and uncertain. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Wilson, but I'm quite far out of town. Perhaps Reed wouldn't mind bringing you in for the meetings, Martha suggested, looking at him expectantly. Put on the spot, Reed nodded. Of course. If Grace wishes to attend. The smile that Grace gave him was worth any inconvenience. Thank you. I'd enjoy that. As they drove back to the ranch, Grace was more animated than Reed had seen her before. Mrs. Wilson is quite knowledgeable about literature. And she mentioned they're planning to establish a small lending library for the community. Reed found himself enjoying her enthusiasm. I'm glad you'll have some female companionship. The ranch can be isolating. I don't mind the quiet, Grace assured him. But it will be nice to meet more people in the area. When they arrived home, Reed helped Grace carry her purchases into the house. Among them was a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? He asked, curious. Grace looked slightly flustered. Just some yarn for a project I'm working on. Reed didn't press, but he wondered what she could be making that required hiding. As the weeks passed and Christmas drew nearer, he occasionally caught glimpses of Grace working on something that she quickly tucked away when he entered the room. The ranch took on a festive air under Grace's influence. Pine boughs appeared over the mantel, their scent filling the house. She baked spiced cookies and made candied orange peel, filling the kitchen with delicious aromas. We should have a tree, she suggested one evening in mid-December. There's a perfect spot in the corner of the parlor. Reed hadn't bothered with Christmas decorations since Sarah died. I suppose we could, he said, surprised by his own agreement. The next day, Reed and Hank rode out to find a suitable pine. As they searched, Hank cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Grace has been good for the place, the foreman said. And for you, if you don't mind me saying so, boss. Reed gave Hank a sharp look. Meaning what exactly? Hank raised his hands defensively. Just that the house feels like a home again. And you're not wearing that scowl that used to send the hands scurrying for cover. Before Reed could respond, Hank pointed to a well-shaped pine. That one looks about right. They returned with the tree, and Grace's delight at seeing it made Reed glad he'd agreed to the tradition. She produced a box of ornaments that she'd found in the attic decorations that Reed had packed away years ago, unable to bear the memories they evoked. Are these all right to use? She asked, sensing his hesitation as she opened the box. Reed nodded, his throat tight. Sarah would have wanted them to be enjoyed. Together, they decorated the tree. Grace handled each ornament with care, asking about the stories behind special ones. Reed found himself sharing memories that had been locked away the Christmas markets in San Antonio, where they'd found the painted wooden stars, the glass bird that had been a gift from Sarah's mother. "It's beautiful," Grace said when they'd finished. Standing back to admire the tree with its candles and ornaments, Reed looked not at the tree but at Grace's face, glowing in the soft light. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "It is." That night, Reed dreamed of Sarah again. In the dream, she was hanging ornaments on a tree, humming a Christmas carol. When she turned to him, her face was peaceful. "You're doing well, Reed," she said. "I'm glad." He woke with tears on his cheeks, but the crushing grief that usually accompanied thoughts of Sarah was tempered by something else, a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The days before Christmas passed quickly. Grace attended her first meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society, returning with stories about the women she'd met and plans for community projects. Reed listened, finding himself interested in her impressions of people he'd known for years, but never really considered. On Christmas Eve, after a simple but delicious supper, Grace disappeared into her room briefly and returned with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For you," she said, holding it out to Reed. "Merry Christmas." Reed stared at the package, caught off guard. I didn't get you anything." Grace shook her head. "You've given me a home and security when I needed it most. That's more than enough." Feeling awkward, Reed accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in a deep forest green, the stitches even and tight. "I noticed your old one was worn through," Grace explained, "and green suits your coloring." Reed ran his fingers over the soft wool. "Thank you, it's very fine work." "You're welcome." Grace hesitated, then added, "I've made something for each of the hands, too." Nothing as elaborate, just warm mittens. Reed felt a surge of affection for this woman who had brought such quiet thoughtfulness into his life. "You've been busy." "I enjoy having purpose," she replied simply. The next morning, Christmas Day, Reed rose early as usual. To his surprise, Grace was already in the kitchen, looking pretty in a dark red dress he hadn't seen before. "Merry Christmas," she greeted him, serving up a breakfast of Jonna cakes with maple syrup, a special treat. "Merry Christmas," he returned, noticing she'd set the table with Sarah's good china. "You didn't need to go to such trouble." "It's not trouble to celebrate properly," Grace said, her eyes bright. "I invited the hands for dinner at noon, if that's all right. I thought they shouldn't be alone today." Reed nodded his agreement. That was thoughtful. As they ate, Reed found himself studying Grace's face. In the 3 months since she'd arrived, some of the shadows beneath her eyes had faded. Her cheeks had filled out slightly, and there was color in her face that hadn't been there before. The ranch had been good for her, too, he realized. After breakfast, Reed excused himself and went to his bedroom. From the back of his wardrobe, he retrieved a small wooden box that he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a silver hairpin with a small pearl at its end, a gift he'd bought for Sarah in San Antonio, but had never given her before she fell ill. He wrapped it hastily in a handkerchief, feeling uncertain. Would Grace think it inappropriate? Would she understand it was a token of appreciation, not an overture? Reed wasn't sure he understood his own intentions anymore. When he returned to the kitchen, Grace was preparing the Christmas dinner. Reed cleared his throat. "I do have something for you after all," he said, holding out the awkwardly wrapped package. "It's not much and it's not new, but I thought you might like it." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the gift. When she unwrapped it, her eyes widened. "Reed, it's beautiful." "It was meant for Sarah," he said honestly, "but I never had the chance to give it to her." Instead of being put off by this admission, Grace seemed touched. "Are you certain you want me to have it?" Reed nodded. She would have approved. Grace carefully pinned it into her hair, securing a stray strand. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door, the Hands arriving for dinner. The day passed pleasantly, with good food and simple fellowship. Grace distributed her handmade mittens, which were received with genuine appreciation by men who worked outdoors in all weather. As Reed watched Grace move among his workers, serving food and engaging them in conversation, he was struck by how naturally she fit into the life of the ranch. It was as if she'd always been there, filling in spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. That night, after the Hands had returned to their quarters and the dishes were washed, Reed and Grace sat in the parlor. The only light came from the candles on the Christmas tree and the dying fire in the hearth. "This has been a wonderful day," Grace said, her voice soft in the dimness. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for making it worth celebrating again," Reed replied. Their eyes met across the room and something shifted in the air between them. Reed felt a tightening in his chest, not the pain of grief, but something else, something both frightening and exhilarating. Grace was the first to look away. "It's getting late. I should get some rest." Reed nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she stood to leave, the firelight caught the pearl in her hair, making it glow softly. "Good night, Reed," she said, pausing at the doorway. "Good night, Grace," he replied, watching her go and wondering at the strange emptiness her absence left in the room. Winter settled fully over the ranch in January. Cold rains alternated with clear, crisp days where frost clung to every surface until mid-morning. The work of the ranch continued: cattle to feed, fences to mend, preparations to make for spring calving. Grace continued to transform the house with small touches. Curtains that had hung dusty and faded were washed and mended. Furniture was rearranged to better catch the winter light. Books that had been packed away appeared on shelves, arranged by subject and author. Reed found himself spending more evenings at home rather than working until exhaustion drove him to bed. Sometimes he would read while Grace sewed or knitted. Other times they would talk about books they'd both read or discuss news from the newspaper. "You miss teaching?" Reed asked one evening after Grace had mentioned helping at the small school her mother had run. Grace considered the question. "I miss the children, their curiosity. But I never taught formally, just assisted my mother when her health began to fail." "You'd make a fine teacher," Reed observed. Grace smiled, pleased by the compliment. "Perhaps someday. Austin is growing rapidly. I imagine they'll need more teachers as families move in." The casual mention of a future beyond her current position caught Reed off guard. Of course, he'd never expected Grace to remain his housekeeper forever. The thought of her leaving, of the house returning to its former emptiness, was surprisingly painful. Their comfortable routine was interrupted in late January by a fierce winter storm that blew in from the north. The temperature dropped rapidly, and sleet began to fall, coating everything in a treacherous layer of ice. Reed and the Hands worked desperately to move cattle to sheltered areas and ensure water sources wouldn't freeze. He returned to the house after dark, soaked through and chilled to the bone. Grace took one look at him and sprang into action. "You need to get out of those wet clothes immediately. Go change while I heat water for a bath." Too tired to argue, Reed did as he was told. By the time he returned in dry clothing, Grace had a steaming bath ready in the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house. "I'll give you privacy," she said, turning to leave. "Wait," Reed called, then faltered when she looked back at him. "The Hands, they're still out there. Could you prepare something hot for when they return? Coffee and food?" Grace nodded. "Of course, I'll take care of it." The hot bath revived Reed somewhat, but exhaustion and cold had taken their toll. By the time he dried off and dressed again, he was shivering despite the kitchen's warmth. Grace took one look at him and frowned. "You need to get warm. Sit by the fire in the parlor while I bring you something hot to drink." Reed didn't have the energy to resist. He sat heavily in the chair nearest the hearth, where Grace had built up the fire to a roaring blaze. She returned moments later with a mug of something steaming and fragrant. "Drink this," she instructed. "It's hot toddy whiskey, honey, and lemon. My father swore by it for warding off chills." Reed took a grateful sip, feeling the warm liquid spread through his chest. "Thank you." Grace draped a quilt over his shoulders. "You're still shivering." "I'll be fine," he insisted, though his teeth had begun to chatter. Grace placed a hand on his forehead, her touch cool against his skin. "You're burning up, Reed. I think you've caught a fever." The next few hours passed in a blur for Reed. The storm outside intensified, wind howling around the eaves of the house. Hank and the other hands returned, half frozen but alive, and Grace served them hot food and coffee before they retreated to their quarters. Reed's condition worsened as the night progressed. Chills racked his body, followed by waves of heat that left him sweating and disoriented. Grace moved him to his bedroom, built up the fire there, and set about caring for him with quiet efficiency. She bathed his face with cool cloths when the fever burned hottest, and piled blankets over him when the chills returned. She coaxed him to drink water and herbal teas, speaking in a low, soothing voice that anchored him when fever dreams threatened to carry him away. In his delirium, Reed sometimes confused Grace with Sarah, calling out his dead wife's name. Other times, he knew exactly who sat beside his bed, and the knowledge filled him with a confused mix of comfort and shame at his weakness. "You should rest," he mumbled during a lucid moment, seeing the dark circles forming under Grace's eyes as she maintained her vigil through the night. "I will when you're better," she replied, adjusting the compress on his forehead. "Sarah died of fever," Reed said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I couldn't save her." Grace's hand stilled momentarily. "This isn't the same, Reed. You're strong, and it's just a chill from being out in the storm." But Reed's mind had slipped back to that terrible time. "I tried everything. Nothing helped. She just kept getting worse." "Essachachate," Grace soothed. "Don't think about that now. Focus on getting well." "She made me promise to live," Reed continued, the words tumbling out now, "not just survive, but I didn't know how." Grace took his hand, her fingers warm around his. "You're doing it now, Reed. You're living." The fever broke sometime before dawn. Reed woke to find Grace asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting at an uncomfortable angle against the high back. The storm had passed, and weak winter sunlight filtered through the curtains. Reed studied Grace's face in repose. The strength was still there, but sleep softened her features, revealing a vulnerability she kept carefully hidden when awake. The pearl hairpin still secured her honey-brown hair, now coming loose from its usual neat arrangement. As if sensing his gaze, Grace stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face, then relief as she registered that his fever had broken. "You're better," she said, straightening in the chair. "Thanks to you," Reed replied, his voice rough from the night's ordeal. Grace shook her head. "You just needed rest and warmth. How do you feel?" "Weak as a newborn calf," Reed admitted. "But the fever's gone. You should eat something." "I'll bring you some broth." Grace stood, smoothing her rumpled skirt. "Grace," Reed called as she reached the door. When she turned back, he struggled to find the right words. "Thank you for staying with me." Her smile was soft with understanding. "Of course." Reed spent the next 2 days recovering his strength, chafing at the confinement but too weak to do otherwise. Grace kept him supplied with nourishing food and checked on him regularly, though she maintained a certain reserve that hadn't been there before. Reed wondered if he'd said something during his fever that had disturbed her. His memories of the night were fragmented, but he recalled speaking of Sarah, and perhaps revealing more of his grief than he'd intended. On the third day, when Reed insisted on getting up for dinner, he found the house unusually quiet. "Where's Grace?" he asked Hank, who had come to report on the cattle. "In town," Hank replied. "Pastor Wilson sent young Tom to fetch her this morning." Something about the schoolteacher taking ill and them needing someone to mind the children for a few days. Reed frowned. "She didn't mention this to me." Hank shrugged. "Probably didn't want to disturb your recovery. She left food prepared and said she'd be back as soon as she could." The house felt strangely empty without Grace's presence. Reed found himself wandering from room to room, noticing all the small changes she'd made over the months. Fresh curtains in the parlor, a vase of dried winter berries on the mantel, books arranged on shelves that had been empty for years. It was more than just the physical changes, though. The house felt different, warmer, more alive. Even with Grace temporarily absent, the emptiness that had pervaded the place after Sarah's death had been banished. Reed sat at his desk and pulled out paper and pen. He began to write, the words coming more easily than he'd expected. "Dear Grace," he wrote, "I find I miss your presence in the house, though you've been gone only a day. Perhaps illness has made me sentimental, but I've been reflecting on how much has changed since you arrived. This house was merely a shelter before, now it feels like a home again." He continued writing, the letter becoming more personal than he'd intended. When he finished, Reed read it over and promptly crumpled it up. What was he thinking? Grace was his employee, nothing more. She'd shown no indication that she saw him as anything other than her employer. And yet, there had been moments, shared glances, lingering conversations by the fire, the careful way she'd tended him during his illness that suggested something deeper might be possible. Grace returned 3 days later, arriving in the wagon driven by Tom Riley. Reed was in the barn when they pulled up, and he stepped outside to greet them. "Welcome back," he said, trying to keep his tone casual even as relief flooded through him at the sight of her. Grace's face lit up with a smile. "Reed, you're looking much better. How are you feeling?" "Fully recovered," he assured her, taking her valise. "How was your time in town?" "Challenging but rewarding," Grace replied as they walked toward the house. "The children were a handful but good-hearted. Mrs. Peterson should be well enough to return to teaching next week." "Did you enjoy it?" "The teaching?" Reed asked, remembering their conversation from before. Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I did. Pastor Wilson mentioned they're considering adding another teacher as more families settle in the area." Again, the implication that Grace might not stay indefinitely caught Reed by surprise. "Would you be interested in such a position?" They had reached the porch, and Grace paused before answering. "Perhaps, though I'm not sure I'm ready to leave the ranch just yet." The way she looked at him when she said this made Reed's heart beat faster. "I'm glad to hear it," he said quietly. "The place wouldn't be the same without you." Something shifted in Grace's expression, surprise, followed by a softening that made her eyes luminous in the winter light. "Thank you for saying that, Reed." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Grace broke the spell. "I should get inside and start supper," she said, though she made no move to do so. "Grace," Reed began, then faltered. Unsure how to express what he was feeling, she waited, her expression open and expectant. "I missed you," he said simply. "The house was too quiet without you." A smile bloomed slowly across her face. "I miss being here too." The admission seemed to cost her something, a small surrender of the careful boundaries they'd maintained. Reed wanted to say more, to take her hand or step closer, but caution held him back. Instead, he nodded and opened the door for her. "Welcome home," he said. February brought a brief respite from winter's grip. Days grew slightly longer, and occasionally the temperature rose enough to melt the frost and hint at the spring to come. Reed threw himself back into the work of the ranch, preparing for calving season and the busy months ahead. Grace continued her duties in the house, but there was a new awareness between them. Conversations lingered longer. Their eyes met more often across rooms. Small touches, a hand brushing while passing a dish, fingers meeting over a book, sent currents of awareness through both of them. Neither spoke of it directly. Reed was hesitant to upset the delicate balance they'd achieved, and Grace gave no clear indication that she wanted more than their current arrangement. Yet Reed found himself thinking of her at odd moments throughout the day, wondering what she might think of a particular view, or remembering the sound of her laughter. In mid-February, a letter arrived from the school board in Austin, offering Grace a teaching position beginning in the fall. Reed happened to be in the kitchen when she opened it, and he watched the play of emotions across her face as she read pleasure, pride, and something that looked like uncertainty. "Good news?" he asked, though he'd already guessed. Grace looked up, seeming almost guilty. "Yes. They've offered me a position at the school, starting in September." Reed forced a smile. "Congratulations. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" "Yes," Grace said, but the word lacked conviction. "It's a good opportunity." "You'll be an excellent teacher," Reed said, meaning it despite the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. "The children will be fortunate to have you." "I haven't accepted yet," Grace added quickly. "I told Pastor Wilson I'd need time to consider." Hope flared briefly in Reed. "There's no rush to decide. You have months yet." Grace nodded, folding the letter carefully. "Yes, plenty of time." The subject wasn't mentioned again, but Reed could sense Grace wrestling with the decision. She seemed distracted at times, and occasionally he would find her gazing out across the ranch with a pensive expression. As February drew to a close, Reed made a decision of his own. He rode into Austin one morning, returning with a small package that he kept hidden in his saddlebag. That evening, after supper, he asked Grace to join him in the parlor. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nervousness coursing through him. Grace sat in her usual chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Is something wrong?" "No," Reed assured her quickly. "Nothing's wrong, it's just—" He took a deep breath. "I understand you have a decision to make about the teaching position." Grace nodded, her expression cautious. "Yes, before you decide, I wanted to offer you another option." Reed reached into his pocket and withdrew the small box he'd purchased in town. He held it out to her, his hand not quite steady. "This isn't how I planned to do this, and if I'm misreading things between us, please forgive me." Grace stared at the box, her eyes widening with realization. "Reed." "I'm not good with words," he continued, needing to get it all out before courage failed him. "But these past months, you've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever. You filled it with warmth and life and laughter. I never expected to feel this way again, never thought I'd want to share my life with someone after Sarah." Grace's eyes had filled with tears, but Reed couldn't tell if they were happy tears or not. "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said quickly. "No one could. But I've come to care for you, Grace, deeply, and if you feel anything similar." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "I'd be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Grace looked from the ring to Reed's face, a tear spilling down her cheek. "Oh, Reed. I never expected." Reed's heart sank. "I've overstepped, I apologize." "No," Grace said quickly, reaching out to touch his hand. "No, that's not what I meant. I've been so careful not to hope for this. I didn't want to presume or to think that you could ever see me as more than your housekeeper." "Is that a yes?" Reid asked, hardly daring to believe. Grace's smile was radiant through her tears. "Yes, yes, I would be honored to be your wife." Reid took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger, his own hands trembling slightly. It fit perfectly. "I wasn't sure of the size," he admitted. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, looking at the sapphire gleaming in the lamplight. "Everything is perfect." Reid reached out, cupping her cheek gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "May I kiss you?" Grace nodded, her eyes never leaving his as he leaned forward. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative meeting of lips that quickly deepened as months of unspoken feelings found expression. When they finally parted, both breathless, Reid kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Grace," he said softly, the words feeling both strange and absolutely right on his lips. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears shimmering in her eyes. "I think I have for some time now." They decided to marry in April, when the wildflowers would be blooming across the ranch. Neither wanted a long engagement, and there were few preparations needed for the simple ceremony they planned. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Most reactions were positive. Pastor Wilson and his wife were particularly pleased, having witnessed the growing connection between Reid and Grace during her visits to town. Not everyone was as supportive, however. Some of the town gossips whispered that Grace had set her cap for the wealthy rancher from the beginning, or that Reid was merely looking for someone to warm his bed and care for his home. "Does it bother you?" Reid asked when Grace mentioned overhearing such talk at the general store. "What they're saying," Grace shook her head, her expression serene. "People will always talk. Those who matter know the truth of what's between us." Reid marveled at her certainty, her ability to rise above petty judgments. "You're remarkable, do you know that, for loving you?" Grace smiled. "That's the easiest thing I've ever done." As their wedding day approached, the ranch burst into spring glory. Bluebonnets carpeted the lower pastures, painting the landscape in swathes of vibrant color. Trees budded and leafed out, and the air grew warm and fragrant. Grace moved her belongings into what would become their shared bedroom, though they had agreed to wait until after the wedding ceremony to truly share it. The room that had once been solely Sarah's and Reid's was transformed, not erasing the past, but making space for a new future. Reid found a small photograph of Sarah, taken in the early days of their marriage, and placed it on the dresser. "She should be here," he said simply when Grace noticed it. "She's part of what made this home." Grace's eyes filled with understanding. "I would have liked to know her." "She would have liked you," Reid said, certain of this truth. "You have the same strength, the same way of seeing beauty in simple things." The day before the wedding, Reid was supervising the construction of a new corral when Hank approached, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Got a minute, boss?" the foreman asked. Reid nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it?" Hank shifted uncomfortably. "It's about Miss Grace, or I suppose soon to be Mrs. Thompson." Reid tensed, immediately defensive. "What about her?" "Nothing bad," Hank assured him quickly. "Just wanted to say. Well, we're all mighty happy for you both. She's a fine woman and you deserve some happiness after everything." Reid relaxed, touched by the sentiment from his usually taciturn foreman. "Thank you, Hank." "There's more," Hank continued, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "The boys and we took up a collection. For a wedding gift, like—" Reid accepted the envelope, surprised by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," Hank replied simply. "Miss Grace has been good to all of us, not just you. Making sure we had proper meals on holidays, mending our clothes without being asked, remembering each man's birthday with a special dessert." The foreman cleared his throat. "She makes this place feel like family, not just a job. Reed was moved by the sentiment, recognizing the truth in Hank's words. Grace had transformed not just the main house, but the entire atmosphere of the ranch. "I'll make sure she knows how much you all appreciate her." "She knows," Hank said with certainty. "That's the kind of woman she is. She notices things others don't." That evening, Reed presented Grace with the envelope from the hands. Inside was a modest sum of money and a note signed by all four men, expressing their well wishes and thanks for her kindness. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she read it. "They're such good men," she said softly. "They think the same of you," Reed replied, watching her face. "As do I." Grace looked up at him, her expression luminous with happiness. "Tomorrow I'll be your wife." "Yes," Reed agreed, drawing her into his arms. "And I'll be the most fortunate man in Texas." Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect. The ceremony was held on the ranch, under a canopy of oak trees near the house. Pastor Wilson officiated, his wife serving as Grace's attendant while Hank stood up with Reed. Most of the town turned out for the occasion, curiosity overcoming any lingering disapproval of the match. Grace wore a simple dress of pale blue silk new, ordered from a dressmaker in Austin with Sarah's pearl hairpin securing her veil. Reed, watching her walk toward him across the grass, felt his heart swell with emotions he'd thought forever lost to him. Grief would always be part of him, but it no longer defined his existence. Grace had shown him that life could contain joy again, that his heart had room for new love alongside the memories of the old. The celebration afterward was lively, with food and music lasting well into the evening. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Reed found a moment alone with his new wife as the festivities continued around them. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her slightly away from the crowd. Grace's smile was answer enough, but she spoke anyway. "More than I ever thought possible. When I came here that day, I was just looking for work, for a place to rebuild my life. I never imagined I'd find all of this." Reed took her hand, the gold band on her finger catching the lantern light. "When you walked into my empty home, I didn't know what I was missing. You filled it with life again, Grace, with laughter and warmth and possibility." "We built something new together," Grace said softly. "Something that honors the past without being bound by it." Reed kissed her then, no longer constrained by the propriety that had limited their expressions of affection before. "And we'll keep building," he promised. "Every day." Later that night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Reed carried Grace across the threshold of the house that was now truly theirs together. The silence between them was charged with anticipation, but also with a deep tenderness that transcended physical desire. In their bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the windows, they came together as husband and wife. Reed's hands trembled as he helped Grace out of her wedding dress, and she was equally gentle as she unbuttoned his shirt. Their first time together was a sweet discovery, both tender and passionate, marked by whispered words of love and soft laughter when nervousness made them clumsy. Afterward, with Grace nestled against his side, Reed felt a sense of completion he hadn't known was missing. "I love you," he murmured into her hair, the words coming easily now. "And I love you," she replied, her voice drowsy with contentment. "My husband." Spring flowed into summer, and the newlyweds settled into their life together. The ranch prospered under Reed's management, while Grace maintained their home and gradually took on more responsibilities outside as well. She had a knack for record-keeping that Reed lacked, and soon she was managing the ranch's books alongside her other duties. In July, Grace began to suspect what a visit to the doctor in Austin confirmed. She was expecting their first child, due in early February. When she told Reed, His face went through a range of emotions: shock, wonder, joy, and a momentary flash of fear before he swept her into a careful embrace. "A baby," he whispered, awed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, knowing that this milestone would inevitably stir memories of his first marriage and the children he and Sarah had hoped for but never had. "Beyond words," Reed assured her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have the chance to be a father." As summer turned to fall, Grace's body changed, her condition becoming visible beneath her dresses. Reed found himself both protective and fascinated, his hand often straying to the gentle swell of her abdomen when they sat together in the evenings. They prepared the third bedroom as a nursery, bringing out the cradle Reed had built years ago for the children he'd hoped to have with Sarah. Grace lined it with soft blankets and hung curtains that would catch the morning light. "Boy or girl?" Reed would ask as they worked, though both knew there was no way to predict. "Healthy is all that matters," Grace would reply, though secretly she pictured a boy with Reed's steady eyes and quiet strength. The months passed with an anticipation that filled their home with a new kind of energy. Christmas came and went, celebrated with a tree that Reed insisted on cutting himself, though Grace was now obviously pregnant. January brought cold weather again, and Grace found herself increasingly confined to the house as her time grew near. Reed hired a young woman from town to help with household chores, insisting that Grace rest more. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she protested, though secretly she appreciated his concern. "Humor me," Reed replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I want to take care of you both." The baby came in the first week of February, during a rare Texas snowfall that blanketed the ranch in white. Grace's labor began in the early morning hours, and by midday, their son entered the world, healthy and strong-lunged. "Robert Reed Thompson," Grace whispered when the midwife placed the swaddled infant in her arms. They had agreed on the name months earlier: Robert for Grace's father, Reed for his own. Reed, allowed into the room after the birth, approached the bed with reverent steps. His face, when he looked down at his son, held such naked emotion that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "He's perfect," Reed said, his voice thick. "Just like his mother." Grace shifted slightly, making room for Reed to sit beside her on the bed. "Would you like to hold him?" With careful movements, Reed gathered his son into his arms. The baby's eyes, dark blue like all newborns, seemed to focus on his father's face for a moment before closing in sleep. "Hello, Robert," Reed said softly. "We've been waiting for you." The years that followed brought more changes to the Thompson ranch. Robert grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's honey-brown hair and his father's quiet intensity. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Sarah Grace, named for the two women who had shaped Reed's life. Grace never did take that teaching position in town, though she occasionally helped at the school when they needed a substitute. The ranch and her family became her life's work, and she found it deeply fulfilling. She and Reed expanded the house as their family grew, adding rooms and modernizing as new conveniences became available. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Reed's knowledge of cattle and Grace's head for figures proved a formidable combination. They were able to purchase additional land, making the Thompson Ranch one of the most successful operations in the county. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work done, Reed and Grace would often sit together on the porch, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked one such evening, her head resting on Reed's shoulder. "That day when I showed up on your doorstep," Reed's arm tightened around her. "Never. I thought my chance at happiness had died with Sarah." And now, Reed looked toward the house, their home, filled with the evidence of their shared life. Children's toys scattered on the porch. A quilt Grace had made draped over the railing. The sounds of their sleeping family carried on the night breeze. "Now I know that life can give second chances," he said, turning to kiss her softly. "You walked into my empty home and filled it with laughter, with love, with everything I didn't know I was missing." Grace smiled, her heart full. "And I found the home I didn't know I was searching for." Together, they sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them side by side, partners in the life they had built together, from grief and hope, from emptiness and laughter.